I would now like to invite Sarah Moles to speak with us. Could you please tell us your name and where you are from?
I'm Sarah Moles. I'm from Warwick on the Darling Downs, and I've been involved in community-based natural resource management, particularly in the Murray-Darling Basin for about 25 years.
Can you tell us from your perspective about the impacts of irrigation on the Darling and its communities?
Thank you. Yes, before I begin, can I pay my respects and acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on whose lands we meet on today, and acknowledge that these lands were never ceded, and also to the traditional owners of the Darling Basin, because I've learned a fantastic amount from them. A quick orientation. Fran kindly showed us a map of the whole of the Murray-Darling Basin. The Darling part of the basin is about 2/3. I'd like to think of it as our Darling Murray rather than the Murray-Darling. You can see, as Fran mentioned, this is what Fran and other experts refer to as a flood pulse river. It's Australia's longest river. It's the quintessentially Australian river, and it's certainly our most iconic. Along the edge of the Darling Basin, the eastern edge, we have a large number of government-owned and built irrigation storages. Most of them hold the equivalent of many hundreds of thousands of Olympic swimming pools worth of water. But the Darling Basin is a little bit different to the Murray insofar as it also has seen massive investment in privately owned on-farm storages, as Fred and Fran were alluding to. Could I have the next slide, please? I took these photos on a flight from Brisbane down to Melbourne, and you can see this is, I'm not quite sure which catchment, probably the Gwydir and the Namoy valleys, and just some examples of the extent and expanse of the private take of water and pumping into privately owned storages. This is the middle reaches of the river. There are certainly lots of little dams, little tiny stock dams further up in the headwaters. But as you move down each one of these valleys, it seems to me that those storages get bigger and bigger until you get to places like Cubby Station, which has one storage that holds 70,000 megalitres, 70,000 Olympic swimming pools worth of water. It's a staggering amount. And those dams were originally built, these private dams were originally built so that farmers could harvest water out of the rivers when the river came up to a particular height. And then there was a loophole in the legislation in both states, and those sort of dams started to be built so that water could be harvested as it was moving across the floodplain, because water outside of the bed and banks of a river was not covered by the legislation. And so the rivers took a double hit. And it's important to understand this in the context of the Flood Pulse River, because all the life that lives in and along the river has evolved to cope, to live and to thrive with a particular range of pulses. And as we've extracted water for our own selfish uses, that pulse has changed. It's been diminished massively. To a great extent, in the absence of laws to regulate the taking of overland flow water, there was just uncontrolled expansion, a bit like the uncontrolled knocking down of native vegetation that Martin Taylor told us about this morning in the lead up to the introduction of laws covering native vegetation clearing. Could I have the next slide, please? And this is the result. This is the Darling River near Tilpa, taken by my friend Julie McClure, who's a grazier on the Darling. That was taken just a few weeks ago, really, not so long after a coordinated release of water from one dam in New South Wales and one dam in Queensland to back up onto a flow, a natural event that was coming out of Queensland, to make sure that enough water could be pushed down the river to save a whole lot of grazing businesses and to save a whole lot of communities from completely running out of water. It's pretty hard to imagine that this is the major artery of New South Wales. This is what keeps that country alive. And once upon a time, there was a thriving paddleboat industry that chuffed up and down here, carrying the wool clip from vast stations all over Western New South Wales and southwestern Queensland. Could I have the next slide, please? This is another result. This photo was taken below Menindee Lakes. This gentleman lives on a property called Avenue between Menindee and Wentworth, which is where the Darling River joins the Murray. You can't actually see it terribly well in this light, but that water is green slime. This is supposed to be stock and domestic water, but it is toxic most of the time. You can't drink it, you can't swim in it, you can't fish, you can't let your animals into it. It is that foul. I've seen signs on every single river valley in the Northern Basin with cute little graphics warning you about contacting that water. And if that isn't a damning indictment of what whitefella management has done to the Darling River, then I have no idea what is. This is a slide created by my friend Jeff Wise, who spent a lot of time as a Western Lands Commissioner in New South Wales. And this is all based on publicly available information, and these are flow statistics from Wilcannia. Now, Fred mentioned Wilcannia. Wilcannia is about halfway down the Darling River. It's overwhelmingly an Aboriginal town, and it's a large community of Barkindji people. The Barkindji have, like Aboriginal people everywhere in Australia, a deep connection to their country, and they have specific obligations to look after the river. Because of its geographic location on the Darling and below where all the northern tributaries join the Darling, the main trunk, Wilcannia wears the impacts of all the development upstream. And the point I want you to take away from this is the right-hand column, the decrease in reliability of water in Wilcannia. The blue columns towards the left are a record of 74 years of flows from 1920 until 1994. And the grey colour are the 22 years since 1995, when the cap on diversions from the Murray-Darling Basin was introduced. And when you look at the bottom number, the reliability of water in Wilcannia has declined by 22%. That is an enormous drop in reliability. It's no wonder that the river is green slime and that people can't swim in it, fish in it, play with their dogs in it. I'm not surprised that Aboriginal people are angry and depressed. I'm angry, and I'm not someone that can speak for country or anything like that. I can barely imagine the grief that Aboriginal people must feel faced with that and knowing that it is absolutely impossible for them to pass on their culture to the current generation. Culture is dying for want of water. And from where I'm standing, I don't think genocide is too tame a word. I'm aware that a couple of well-connected white fellas, politically well-connected and very well-connected business-wise, made representations to a certain New South Wales government minister and had the water sharing plan for the Barwon Darling changed in their favour. 2 or 3 people did that. I'm not sure what the population of Wilcannia is, but they have been crying about the state of their river for a very long time, and those cries have been falling on deaf ears. I personally do not believe that that would have been the case if Wilcannia was a predominantly white community. One of the things that I think is so tragic about the impending loss of Indigenous culture is that encoded in your law, Fred, is a whole lot of ecological wisdom that holds the keys to how we live sustainably, how we manage our rivers in a sustainable way that will give everybody a reasonable quality of life, that will share the pain and the plenty, the burden and the bounty. And that's just right out of order, something like that. Can I have the next slide, please? It's about 15, 18 months now since Four Corners aired the episode called Pumped that blew the lid off corruption in the Murray-Darling Basin and the illegal taking of water, the lack of compliance, particularly by the New South Wales government. Frankly, tip of the iceberg. I'm watching this space with bated breath because I know that there is more to come, and I can't wait for a very bright light and a very, very forensic examination to be made of exactly what has gone on. So what we've seen, in my opinion, is a massive failure of public policy. And the response from the New South Wales Government and the Murray-Darling Basin Authority is to fix it with an engineering solution. Now, it has been in the media, but not a lot of people seem to be aware of it. But there is a pipeline just about completed, a $500 million project from Wentworth on the Murray to pipe water to Broken Hill, which used to get its water supply from the Menindee Lakes. The people of the Menindee area, and particularly the Barkindji people, do not want this pipeline. The people of Broken Hill don't want this pipeline. They're deeply suspicious of the motivations behind it. They are aware that when the business case was put out to be reviewed by a major consulting firm, they found the business case to be extremely thin, wanting in a whole lot of detail and information. And by the way, where is the environmental impact statement? There are hopefully soon to be exposed reasons why this project is being rammed through, but part of it seems to be that we don't have to give any more water to the Darling River because we can just pipe water up there, and just let's forget about the fact that Menindee is not only one of the most important fish breeding sites in the entire Murray-Darling Basin, it also has enormous spiritual and cultural significance to Indigenous communities. To finish, I would like to tender a piece of evidence to the panel. Fred, I was amused to hear you mention a poem from Uncle Bill Riley called The Dying Darling. About 12 years ago, I travelled through the Darling Basin and interviewed many people and wrote a book called The Dying Darling, which I think neatly sums up opinions of what's gone wrong and why. And the thing that depresses me more than anything about having written this book is how much worse it is today. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Does the panel have any questions?
Oh, yeah.
You go.
Sarah, you talked about the sort of, I guess, the difficulties you have with what's been going on and the background to that sort of stuff. From your point of view, has the social determinants been a factor in terms of the calculation and the impacts that are having on those communities across that whole Darling Basin area? I mean, when you talk about the communities, we're talking about physical health, and that was mentioned in the panel today, but also the mental health, and that's escalating quite considerably. And people have noted that that's actually related to the changes in environment, and particularly water flows. Have you at all looked into that in some detail, or was somebody looking into that in terms of detail?
It's a good question. During the Northern Basin review process, which Fred and I were both involved in, the Murray-Darling Basin Authority commissioned socio-economic impact assessments of irrigation-dependent communities. I thought it was deeply lacking that the benefits of returning water to the river was not assessed, the benefits that would accrue to floodplain grazing communities, to Indigenous people, to the tourism sector, to fishing, etc., etc., etc. It's been all about the costs of the Murray-Darling Basin Plan, not about the benefits.
From a commercial point of view?
From a financial and economic point of view, yes. But I would say that people get emotional about water, and I get very tired of people saying, let's have a discussion just based on the facts and let's not get emotional about it. Try saying that when you've got none. And Aboriginal people don't have access to much water, and Aboriginal people have a right to water, and we need Aboriginal people's wisdom to lead us out of the mess that we've got ourselves into. I would also add that I thought it was deeply regrettable that the cultural flows research work that Fred was closely involved in was not completed in time for the Northern Basin Review, so that the learnings from that work, which was wonderful, groundbreaking work for Australia, did not inform the Northern Basin Review at all.
It's really disappointing, because I noticed that with Fred he was talking about, your previous speaker was that the red gums will tell you a story, and if they go, you know you're in deep trouble.
I suspect it's too late for a lot of the black box forests in the Darling part of the basin, but yes, I think I defer to Fran as an expert in these things, but if we don't get red gum recruitment very soon, then we probably lose those red gum forests forever, unless we're prepared to get out there and spend. It's very, very difficult to revegetate from scratch.
Thank you.
I just have one question, Sarah. Thank you very much for your talk. If you were to point the finger at a couple of very direct, specific actions, what would you like to see happen immediately?
I would like to see the low and medium flows returned immediately to the Barwon-Darling River system. As Fran said, and as Fred alluded to, the low flows have completely disappeared from the pattern of flows. The medium flows have become low flows. The big flows have become median flows. The irrigators can't do too much to the really big flows, but the length of time between those events is stretching out, and in-stream life in particular can't cope with that. So that would be the first thing that I would want to see happen. I would also like to see something like a National Water Commission reinstated, so that we have an independent, completely independent body to assess and accredit the new generation of water sharing plans, because frankly, I don't believe the states are to be trusted, and I'm not convinced that the Commission is either.
And can I ask them more specifically, to get more flow down, we obviously have to stop diverting all the water out. Which particular industries or food and fibre activities do you think are most important to address?
The issue is over-allocation. I think Fran made this point. You know, take cotton out of the system, irrigators will grow something else. They'll grow whatever gives them the best return and is suited to their soils and climatic conditions, etc., etc., etc. I think that there's a lot of work that needs to be done on water sharing plans. I'm unspeakably angry that New South Wales is about to licence and therefore legitimise a lot of the floodplain harvesting infrastructure, including some of those whopping great ring tanks, when if we are serious about returning, the sustainable diversion limit is a first step. This is the first Murray-Darling Basin plan. There will be others. This one is not good enough.
Okay. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.
Thank you.